Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started since it's 10:03. All right, good morning, everybody. Morning, Katie. If you'll go ahead and bring up. And as always, I have the same first slide that some of you have seen over and over and over, but there may be people on the call that have not joined us previously. So I just always like to start with this and how the process works. Our district task force, or those of us that are on the panel here today, in the middle, which is looking at the overall planning coordination, asking great questions. Karen Hirsch is the representative for the Board of Education, and we have a meeting tonight, so she takes information back to them as well. It's built on those dark blue boxes around the outer edge. I'll start on the top right, is to maintain health and safety for all of our staff and our students. Obviously, that's at the top of the list. The enhanced focus on social emotional learning. And again, we heard a lot last spring as we were coming out of learning that each child, each student really reacted in their own unique way to distance learning, and it was very difficult for some. Certainly for some children. I actually had an email late yesterday afternoon, and it was from a parent who was sharing the experiences from their two children, and one absolutely thrived in distance learning, and the other one it was incredibly difficult for. So again, focus on social emotional learning, and that also includes the adults and all of our staff who are kind of living in a time that they have never experienced before in education, and being asked to do some very different things than we have ever asked of educators or our staff ever. So high quality programming for all ages. And then the last one on the top left was the analysis of achievement data, which is going to be very important coming off of last spring, just to see where students are. Accelerating the pathway, we want to make sure that we're teaching the curriculum, that we're still progressing, maximizing learning gains for all students. And so we're prepared to do that. The white boxes on the outer edges are all those different focus groups that are working incredibly hard for us to be prepared to open in September. And it's taken a Herculean effort from many departments. I would say all departments. Go ahead, next slide. Just as a reminder, these are the different task force meetings that we have held, and all of these are recorded. You can go back and watch any of the meetings. Lots of information has been presented, and we'll continue to do that. We also have a Board of Education meeting tonight. There was one specifically on this topic that was held just this past Tuesday. Again, all of these are recorded. They're all posted online, as well as the documents. We've also had several different focus groups, which is the next slide. And just gives you an idea. We've been very busy trying to hear from the community. We have had special education focus group, elementary, secondary. We've done a Q&A for Spanish speakers. We have had a specialist focus group. I did a PTAC with Dr. Carabillo input session yesterday, which was fantastic. It went for an hour and a half, and I think the next one I need to just block off 3 hours. They had great questions. Sorry, can you go back one? We also have a special education focus group, another one, and this was at the request of the group. It's going to happen today because they have more questions, so want to continue the conversation. We do have two items that are brand new on here. These are staff town hall and community town hall, and these two meetings we're adding just so that we can make sure that, again, we're hearing from as broad from the community as we can. And when our staff met this week, we decided to do that on around July 30th. And this will be very much like a large Zoom call like this. What happened? Oh, a large Zoom call where we can have up to 500 people. The questions will be submitted electronically, so that we can have a moderator asking those questions. And we're going to try to just, again, we're doing this on July 30th because at that time, parents will be making decisions about whether they're going to be choosing to go distance or whether they want to return face-to-face. Our staff will also be at the point where they're working with HR, looking at some of those decision points. And we know it's going to be a critical time for the community. So they will have brand new questions that they haven't had in the past. We also have the question and answer input document. As of the 14th, there were 445. I think that might have even grown a little higher. Karen Hirsch probably knows how many. I can't thank her enough. She volunteered on Tuesday to help us sort the questions. And I'm not sure Karen knew what she was volunteering for. she was still working on it late yesterday. So thank you, Karen, for doing that. We're going to try to start answering those so that we will have a very robust document with lots of questions and answers segmented by categories, so that makes it a little easier for the community, because it's a lot of questions. Thank you, Mike. Next slide. I'm going to hit on lots of different topics today, and it's really based on a lot of the questions that Karen was sorting for us, and also the questions when I'm on the input meetings. A lot of the same questions come up over and over, which means that you know, a lot of people are busy. They don't have time to watch these types of meetings. They're looking for information, so I keep trying to get information out there. For our school calendar adjustment on Tuesday night, we proposed that we adjust our calendar for the start of next school year. And I do want to be really clear, because in one of the news articles, it said we were adjusting for, I can't remember what language they used, but it wasn't just to prepare for COVID. It is actually for professional development for teachers, because we have specific COVID requirements that, as of about 3 weeks ago, the Connecticut State Department of Education put forward. We need to make sure that we are meeting all of those, on top of just getting ready, coming back off of COVID, getting teachers' classrooms ready, getting technology set up, and we also have some new technology tools. So tonight we have a proposal which actually puts the orientation day on the 8th. It's after Labor Day, and all students on September the 9th. Now, between Tuesday and Thursday, we had another notification from the state that they are providing a waiver for 3 instructional days. So students, instead of going 180 days this year, are only required to attend 177 if those days are utilized at the beginning of the year. So by the end of the day, they had really clarified the beginning of the year, because initially when we were talking, even when I was talking with our teachers union, I believe it was Wednesday, I was at that point, we were thinking we may bank the days in the middle of the year in case we need them, but if we did that, we would lose them. So what it means is that we were able to take a few instructional days right before school starts, and instead of having instruction, make those professional development without increasing days to go all the way to June 30th. So it was very helpful for school districts. Obviously, there was a very high request for them to come out with a waiver. Thanks, Mike. I'm just going to review this slide. I know we talked about it as a planning team, but again, this is probably one of the biggest questions that I get, is people are trying to wrap their head around how this is really going to work in your cohorts. You know, what is a cohort? A cohort is a group of children or students and teachers that primarily stay together during the day to try to minimize contact. And that cohort number right now is sitting at 50. We believe it will be closer to 100 or 150 by the time school starts. So if a student has a parent at home who tests positive, that student will quarantine for 14 days. But the student is not the one that has COVID, it's the student's parent. So that does not shut down an entire classroom if the student is not positive, but the student would actually be quarantining. If a teacher has a family member who tests positive, then that same happens for the teacher. The teacher quarantines for 14 days. So it's, and again, we're gonna see this kind of morph and change. And as a matter of fact, Mary Keller sent me a chart just about 30 minutes ago. I'm gonna have to look at it closer, but we're trying to get the decision trees a little clearer to help people. Mary Keller, did you have anything you wanna add to that since you were looking at that decision tree? Is there anything new from the nursing organization as far as the decision-making in schools?
Well, I did want to say that the other day on Tuesday, I think I must have had a Dr. Fauci moment where, you know, with all of the stuff swirling around in my head, we talked about quarantining, having a second quarantine. And I reviewed it with Carol and Baisley. I asked some of my other supervisors. I actually spoke with Karen Hirsch about it. And we looked at the CDC guidance again, and it isn't, you don't have to start over if there was no exposure to the classroom. So I just wanted to clarify that for everybody, that that's on me. Too many quarantine dates all swirling around in my head, but that's where we were. As far as, I really like that little chart, the difference between quarantining for an exposure and the length of time that you actually are out because you have illness are different. I think that has to stay in your brain while you're looking at the chart. But I think it was very good. That's all.
So are they
Thank you
looking
for clarifying that. It was very confusing reading through the CDC documents as well, and I'm certainly not a physician, so I appreciate your looking back at that.
Yeah.
So Mary, is it likely that as we learn more going into August, that they're going to say if there has been an exposure where, let's say, the student is not positive but a parent was positive, so we send everybody home, disinfect the classroom, and the students would come back sooner than 14 days? Am I understanding that correctly?
If the student had an exposure to the parent, yes, the student would be quarantined, could possibly come back after 10 days if they did not exhibit symptoms at any point during that 10 days, or yeah.
Okay.
Yes, they could come back earlier than 14 days. Yeah.
Okay. And we're going to continue to refine. We really want those decision trees that help everybody understand if this happens, this is that next step. And so we're working on that. And I've said this a couple of times. We were told initially that we would get that from the state so that everybody in the state was under, the same guidance, but we still don't have it. And I'm not sure it's coming. So we are, working to prepare that on our own so that we at least have the guidance for our local community based on the health professionals. So we are working on that. Go ahead, Mike, to the next slide, please. So what happens if a student tests positive? So this is that next layer Mary was just speaking about. It's not just exposure. The student is actually positive. This would actually, the student would quarantine, the cohort would quarantine, and possibly a school, depending on where the movement has been. So if we have a student, for instance, who rides the bus, they're going to have very mixed cohorting when we're looking at who is on their actual bus. It could have students from perhaps all across the building. So again, this is where that kind of tracing comes in and understanding who they've come in contact with. What happens if the teacher tests positive? Again, the students would go home, the cohort would quarantine, and possibly it could be the school. And I should probably actually update this to even say administrator. We've had a lot of questions about administrator movement around the building. And of course, our administrators have to move around the building. And so they do come in contact with even more people than a teacher would. So it could cause the school to quarantine depending on who the people are and who they've come in contact with. And we're doing everything possible as we're working on scheduling to minimize, contact across the building. But there will be some positions, and especially when we look at an area like special education, it may not be the whole building, but you only have a few special education teachers. So they are definitely going to have more than one grade level that they're in contact with. It's small numbers, very restrictive as far as, the cleaning, making sure the plexiglass is there, but still, if a teacher did become ill, it could impact the students, it could be the cohort, and it could be the school. Again, yes, go ahead.
Should, under where it says what happens if the teacher tests positive, should that say teacher quarantines for 14 days?
Yeah, it should actually. Thank you.
And can I also add, I know that we're discussing these in broad strokes for what we need to submit to the state, but obviously going forward closer to school, I know that so many of the questions that had been sent in, a lot of them were specifically on quarantine protocol and all of that. Will we be able to put together something with a much richer document so people understand a little further? Because obviously we have teachers, like you said, specialists who are going from classroom to classroom, special teachers who are also teaching specials, subs, and so forth.
Yeah, that's the decision tree. That's what I was just speaking to you, Karen, that initially we were told that the state health was going to provide that. So we're working on those on our own, and trying to figure out, what that needs to look like so it's easy for people to understand. And that's one of the charts that Mary Keller, had sent this morning, is where you can actually see, how everything connects. So we're working on it.
Perfect. I just know that there were so many questions specifically about that I think that the more
absolutely, yeah,
that's provided, the better. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. That's why I put these slides on there again, just somebody new might be watching today, because this has come up really on every focus group. This is probably the #1 question.
Hey,
and
Tony.
they all ask how we're going to manage it, and we just say it's going to be difficult, but we will manage it. Sean, go ahead.
Quarantine for 14 days. Do you think we need to clarify that it's calendar days versus school days?
Oh, good idea. Yep. As a matter of fact, I think Mary Keller just referenced like 10 school days in her answer. So that would be.
And in the previous chart, there's a misspell on the first question.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead. Thanks. For remote learning school, we've had a lot of questions on this, and this is for those families who are actually choosing not to return in face-to-face school. And for those families who are choosing that, it is like enrolling in another school, and it is actually called a school. Now, as I say that, I have a message that just popped up literally, 5 minutes ago from the state. And so we're going to have another call with them. They may want to call it something else. But this was language from the state in how we have to manage this as of last week. But a remote option will be available for families who choose not to return, and this is required. The district has to offer this. If they choose the remote learning school and they want to come back to school, let's say school starts and a month into school, they decide, I think my child could go back now. COVID seems like it's, everything is fine in the environment. I would rather them be back at school. They just have to give us a 2-week notice. And with that 2-week notice, that's so that we can find a classroom for them. Because again, we have to, make sure we don't overload any one class. And we could have 4 second graders in one building that are all requesting to come back at the same time. In secondary, it's making sure we have their schedule built. And again, that takes time for the counselors to go in and make sure that that's done. We will have information that will go out on or around July 27th. And that's when we will ask parents to make their choice about distance learning, the remote school, or if they want to return face-to-face. Also information for our staff, for those staff members who may have health or medical, because that alone is a large piece in, if we have, X amount of teachers that have some sort of medical condition that they need to be talking to HR about, we then have to go in and see, are they still able to remote teach? It just may be they can't be back in this large environment. Then what are their subject areas? What is their certification as we start to build the remote learning school? A remote learning is a teacher live online during the school day. Some courses could be streamed into the classroom, given that a teacher may not be available. So if we have, for instance, a high school student who is in remote learning school because their parents don't want them to return, and they're in, and I'm just going to use something like AP Calculus, and the AP Calculus teacher is not a distance learning teacher, and we don't have anybody who had a medical condition or for whatever reason has the capability to teach AP Calculus, then that student may have that one class where they're actually streaming into Greenwich High School, simply because that's where the teacher is to be able to get the content that the student needs. So it'll be a little bit more complex in high school, a little bit easier in elementary, where elementary certification is broader. Yes, sorry, Mary.
Would it be possible to put a slide before this one that has those definitions in it? So as you start having the models show up in subsequent slides, because like, what's the difference between live online and streaming? I think if you have some definition, then when you start referring to them in the models, it would be clear for people what the differences are.
Yeah, we actually, one of the things that Ann is working on, Dr. Carabillo is working on for us, is actually getting example. She had some teachers record their summer school yesterday, parent permission from the students' parents, trying to put together some samples of here's what it looks like. And you know, I know at Cabinet we talked about this week, the difference between being on a Zoom or a Google Meets type classroom versus I have a camera in my classroom because half of the class is live in my room and a student sitting at home watching the teacher watching that classroom. That's what we're considering the streaming aspect. But we do need to help people understand what that's going to look like. Absolutely.
Can I ask one more quick question?
Sure.
When we send information out to families as so that they can make decisions whether they're going to be participating in our remote learning school or in-school classes, will there be more detail for them to understand, like a sample schedule of understanding how much of their core classes and education will be delivered via live teaching or streaming from a classroom versus what students will be doing sort of online on their own? I think parents need to be able to make those decisions. They sort of need to have an understanding of how much of the content's going to be delivered live streamed or taught versus self-taught, you know, and or which classes that might be. If we give them a sample schedule or two that might be really helpful.
Yeah, it's going to be definitely easier in elementary and much more difficult at high school. High school is almost like individual students just because of their schedules. But I'm actually going to, go ahead and go to the next slide. The next 3 slides are actually Mark, who's going to just talk very kind of briefly about this whole schedule piece. So you led right into that for us, Karen. Thank you. Mark.
Nice segue, Karen. Thank you so much. Good morning to our 99 viewers. I think it's important to kind of frame my thinking before I share the model. I think we all have to keep in mind that the virus is not going to bend to our desires and wishes to return to school under normal conditions. And so we have to approach this work thinking how we can be flexible and mindful to the constraints that the virus presents, right? So when I think of remote learning, I do think of a pathway because we are going to go down a road that we have not traveled down before. And so as we do that, I think it's important to explain to people very simplistically what this looks like. So if we could switch to the next slide, here's the goal. We want to provide a seamless learning experience for students of the Greenwich Public Schools when faced with the need to step out of our traditional brick and mortar setting. The important thing to remember here is our curriculum does not change based on where we're delivering it from. What changes is the tools that we use to provide that implementation. So if we go to the next slide. So in thinking of it from a high level view, we need to identify criteria for success. And when I thought about the specific criteria that's listed here, I first reflected on what went well in the spring, what didn't go well, the feedback we've received to date. And then also, and I want to give credit to Mr. Scher, he stated this the other night in the Board of Ed meeting, there really are a lot of districts across the country and the world that were faced with having to solve these problems sooner than us because the kids are coming back to school sooner than us. There's no better example than the West Coast right now. And if you think of California and how there's the Los Angeles district, and then there's Orange County, and then there's San Diego Unified. Orange County is wedged in between the two, but yet they're going back to school with no constraints whatsoever. And the two that are on the outside, Los Angeles and San Diego, they are going to a remote learning. So in looking at other examples from across the country, I've taken information from Maine, from Virginia, from Florida, from California, and really, even though we haven't had a remote learning experience in history, these are starting to emerge as to what the best practices need to be. So let's go through them. Number one, we need to have a 50-50 balance between live and asynchronous lessons. And I put in parentheses, pre-recorded. Asynchronous is a word that we don't use often. So let's keep in mind live versus things teachers will prepare ahead of time for students. And I think it's critically important to note that pre-recorded lessons really do serve a great value to our students because they have the opportunity to go back and watch it over and over again for content and for clarity. Second bullet, clear and consistent daily learning schedules. Those will be posted by each building principal so that if we need to pivot, and again, we need to be very nimble. If we need to pivot on a day's notice or less than a day's notice, parents need to be able to know exactly where to go on the website to see their child's schedule. We want kids to be in a routine. Kids crave routine. Parents, I think, do as well. So we're going to provide that. Bullet 3, we're being very thoughtful about a comprehensive front-loaded PD schedule for staff. And I'm really excited about the fact that we will have additional time before school starts, if the Board of Ed approves the budget tonight, to give teachers what they need to be successful. Next bullet, we are working on the back end of making sure that we're adjusting the technology resources that we're providing to teachers. We heard very clearly from the elementary teachers that the iPads were very difficult to instruct from. So we're going to shift towards laptops. And so again, in thinking of that, you might say, well, it's very easy to pick up a laptop and onboard all of my information. But we're going to provide specific PD to make sure teachers are comfortable using those laptops, and microphones and cameras for live streaming events. Next bullet. I think this is really important. We will do much better than we did in the spring, but that doesn't mean it's going to be perfect right from the start. So we need to hear from you. So we're going to find ways to solicit your feedback continually when we're in a remote learning experience so we can continue to get better and refine practices. And then finally, there has to be a grading rationale. And so the GPS administration will look at that as well. So those are the overarching criteria for success in a remote learning environment. And now, Karen, to answer your question, what does it look like? Let me preface by saying this is a conceptual model. I petitioned one of the elementary principals to put something together for me to kind of represent visually for you what a day could look like. So this is a sample elementary schedule. And if you look at the notations in green, what you will find is those are the live events. So I really firmly believe that every morning we need to start by seeing our kids. We need to say hello. We need to have that point of contact for a social emotional learning activity. And you'll see that I bookended the day with a closing SEL activity. The hellos and goodbyes are really important at the elementary level. Kids need to feel connected to their teacher and to their classmates. Then what you might see is a humanities mini lesson. And I've already revised the slide. What I'm talking about here is reading predominantly and also then social studies, a mini lesson. Then there would be independent time. So you change the color to pink. This is time where asynchronous events will occur, but it is also a time, and I want us to be flexible in our thinking, where a teacher could pull breakout groups. Then there would be a shift for snack time. Teacher would be available for questions and support. And then the light blue are live events again, but they're with different teachers, whether it be the music teacher or the PE teacher, the media teacher. The dark blue right now, and again, this is current thinking, is that PE may be more playlists than live, but we haven't come to a final conclusion on that. So again, I want to stress, this is a conceptual model. There are warehouses across the country with many concept cars from GM that never actually hit the floor. But we feel pretty good about where this concept is right now, but it is evolving, so I want to stress that. Then you go back to a math mini lesson in the afternoon, live instruction again, and then the independent practice with opportunities for teachers to pull small groups or answer questions. There needs to be time for lunch, recess, and just a break. And then we can circle back again to another content area that's critically important, live lesson in science, interactive read aloud, and closing the day with a, like I said earlier, social emotional learning activity. Now, this is one way you could approach this, but I would hope everyone would agree that this is very different and I think somewhat more sophisticated and involved to what we had in the spring. And the goal is to really kind of standardize this for parents so you can count on this. Whether we give you a call Tuesday night saying, unfortunately, your class is going into quarantine and you have to pivot on Wednesday, you would see this. The same thing as to whether or not you would have to, unfortunately, receive that call on a Thursday and pivot on a Friday. We want consistency. We want clarity. We want to eliminate as much confusion as possible. So I hope that this was somewhat helpful, Karen, and to everyone tuning in to kind of understand where we're going with remote learning 2.0 in the school year 2020-21.
I just want to say a huge, huge thank you. I think that,
Oh, hold on.
am I muted still? I just wanted to say a huge thank you because I know that this is going to be fantastic. I know that this is what a lot of parents and probably educators were most focused on when we talk about educational delivery. So this is a huge, huge, huge thank you from me on their behalf.
And while we don't have a middle school schedule or high school schedule, their schedules will be their schedules, if that makes sense. So, you know, if you have a distance learning schedule, their schedule will look like it would if you were in face-to-face, because they have multiple different teachers that will come online with the students. So, so thanks to Mark. I think this is huge, and we'll share this again tonight with the full board, just again so that people continue to hear how we're trying to grow.
And I did just want to clarify, because I think I did hear Mr. D'Amico mention this, that should your class be quarantined or a student is quarantined, that they would receive a sample schedule so that they could seamlessly move from in-school learning to possibly having to do something like this, even if it's live streaming into their current classroom or moving into is that correct?
You know,
just for the remote learning school.
Well, if you're in the remote learning school, this is what your day would look like. If your class is quarantined and the teacher's at home and not ill, this is what your schedule would look like. If the teacher is teaching live, and I'm just going to say 4th grade teacher, and one student is home for 14 days, yes, you can stream into the classroom, but it's not going to look like this would look necessarily, in that streaming doesn't have, well, it's a static view is what I'm trying to say. The interaction is different, because if a teacher is standing up at the smart board, you know, and having a conversation with the class, and you have 1 or 2 students who can see the class, their interaction is not going to be as high as it would if you were actually in a remote school. Is that what you meant, Karen?
You know, if we put a little asterisk on this to say it does say schedule in remote learning. And if we say that this is the schedule for the remote learning school, you know, there can be a little asterisk just saying, you know, if you're quarantined, it may, you know, just so that people don't assume that this is exactly what's going to happen. If you're quarantined at home, you move into this. I just want to make sure that it's very clear, because
yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
So if we were in full distance learning, the whole district, everybody would look like this, or if you're in distance learning school.
Right. And then, you know, quarantine is different. Just as long as we put an asterisk there, and that they could just so they don't get confused and expect this if this isn't going to be the case. That's all.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Managing expectations.
Thank you. Next slide. We're just going to go through some different questions that were, I'm just going to say, submitted often or frequently. They come up in different groups. Will distance learning show up on a transcript? This has been a question that I've received, which is of course a big concern to high school families who may want a remote school because they're not comfortable coming back. And it will not show up because it's still learning. It's the same content, it's the same curriculum. The expectation is that we are teaching the curriculum. So there's, whether it's distance or remote or sitting in class, it's the same content. So there's not going to be an asterisk by your class or anything like that. What happens on a remote learning day at GHS if the whole class is out? And this has come up because the schedule that we're considering for GHS right now, as we kind of make those final decisions, would be the building is on a hybrid schedule because of the number of students, trying to make sure that we can have social distancing, which means half of the high school is on site while half is at home. And the half that are on site would be, for instance, the A group Monday, Tuesday. Wednesday, everybody would be home so that we are disinfecting the building during the day. And when everybody is at home, the teacher would be on a situation like we're doing right now, where it's the live teaching through Google Meets with their students. So the students would all still follow their schedule. They would all still be engaged. And then Thursday, Friday, the B group is back on site. And that does give that 5-day break in between each one of those groups where they're off site. So this question comes up because they want to know, especially on the Wednesday, is it more like a Flex Friday was last year? And no, it's not. It actually is still their schedule. Karen?
I know you mentioned that the governor had pushed back on that type of model. Did we get any clarification?
We have not. And it's interesting because I'm not hearing other districts change their course either, in that, you know, if we look at their guidance document that they gave us, there's a decision tree in there that they utilized, and you know, that is their guidance document, and it comes straight from the CDC. And it says, as you go along, if you can't meet X, Y, and Z, which is like the safety guidelines that they've given us, then no, you should not return a full return. So we're using their own guidance document. So as I've really processed this over the last week, I suppose that answers the question for us, and that we're doing what they told us to do, even though they've told everybody also to return full time. So I'm going to wait and see what happens. They meet generally, I know, there's a pretty big meeting that happens on Friday mornings, and that seems to be when we get a lot of our updates. And my superintendent's group meets at 11 o'clock, and by that time, the state has had their meeting. So I'll see what they say this week, but they have not responded to my request that I sent in.
Thank you for the clarification.
You're welcome. The other question that we get a lot is, well, how's the district going to find substitutes when it's hard to find substitutes anyway? In this environment, are substitutes really going to want to come in the building? We're having a lot of discussion. We have some full-time substitutes that are in each building, and we're looking right now at making sure that the way those are scheduled, that they're not across the whole district, you know, that they're actually set with certain buildings. But the reality is, if we start having a lot of staff who are sick, or, you know, for a variety of reasons, not just COVID, just, you know, having a high absenteeism, could be stress under this situation. And if we are having a lot and we don't have the subs and we don't have the staff, that will cause us to go back to remote learning, what we call distance learning last spring, because ultimately you have to have adults with children to have school. So we could reach a situation where it does become very difficult if we don't have the subs who are willing to go, you know, to come with us. And, you know, a lot of people think that if you look at Stanford, where they have laid off about 127 teachers, but when you would think, okay, they would be happy just to come and sub some days or do some days, but that's not necessarily the case. If they're on something like unemployment, then they could make less money subbing for us than they could on unemployment, which is a little bit more steady. So it just depends on individual situations, and we'll gauge it day by day and week by week. But we have to have subs to have class. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry, facilities. So these are some of the big facilities questions that I'm getting. So what type of ventilation does GPS utilize across the district, and what is our MERV rating? And MERV is minimum efficiency reporting value, just for those of you that don't use that word often in your vocabulary. So the ventilation right now, most of our systems are an 8. And what you will hear, and that's because we have some systems that are older, they're different all across the district, but generally the standard in a school is around an 8 as far as the filter. Now, they will tell you that for COVID, they like to see a filter that's between 13 and 16. Our head of facilities is doing some analysis with that right now, because when you go to a higher level filter, it also means that there's less air that's obviously, just like when you have your mask on, if you have a thicker mask, less air that's moving, which could also shut down the entire unit and burn out the motor, because you're not getting the same airflow that is the guidance for the actual units. So we are going to do the very best that we can with what we have, but you cannot go in even over a summer and change out HVAC units. That's a huge task, and it's millions and millions of dollars. So if we get to a situation again where, you know, we're not comfortable with what we have, it will push us back to remote learning. But we're doing everything we can from that standpoint. The classrooms that do have windows that open, it will be a fine balance between children who have allergies who are in the classroom and opening the window, and we're going to have to balance that. So, because as you know, in the fall especially, we have some children, if you open the window, you know, they have allergy challenges, and staff as well. But if they can't open the window, they will. Will students be outside? We will be outside as much as we can. What we can't do is count on teaching outdoors on the playground as actual teaching space to balance out a building, because all it would take is a week of rain, and then you're trying to bring all the kids back inside, and it doesn't, and you don't know where you're going to put them. So we have to plan to be inside, and then teachers, as they always do, will do a great job of working within their buildings to schedule outdoor spaces, because we will want to have mask breaks. A teacher may want to do their, read aloud outside with children. We're going to do as much of that as we can. Middle school and high school will also have to mitigate, how they're going to have those outside opportunities. Obviously, at lunchtime, they're used to going out. And even at the high school, they use the front courtyard area throughout the day. So we will be using as much space as we can. Another question that right now from one school is about Ham Ave and managing their playground, because some of you may not be aware, but their playground is under construction right now. So they knew going into this school year that they do not have their playground. What they will have is the climbing equipment, and we will have to make sure, obviously, that's disinfected differently, because it'll probably have more students on it throughout the day. They will have their blacktop. For those families that are watching that project, if you look right now at Ham Ave, those are, there's a fence around them. You can't use the blacktop and you can't use the play equipment, but it will be available when school starts. That's just because they're in construction right now, and it's at that higher level of safety for summer to keep everybody off of the project. So the next question is a question that was in the document we had several times. Why is Eastern not on a modified schedule given how many students are in the building? And people are comparing Eastern to Greenwich High School. And again, we look at every single building differently. The way that middle school students move around the building is very different than the way high school students move. They are in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade type cohorts that doesn't happen at the high school, especially with juniors and seniors who are all over the building. The other thing about Eastern is Eastern, of our 3 middle schools, is built to hold more students. So it's not like it's, yes, it's almost at capacity as far as student space, but it is built to hold more students. So you can't compare it to Central or Western. The other thing about Eastern is the classrooms are larger in square footage than our other 2 middle schools, which is helping Eastern a little bit. And then the other piece is that not all of our electives will be running the electives will look different in middle school. So there are spaces that are available that to be used as a classroom that are not normally available, including areas like the media center. Students will not be going to the media center like they normally would. That would be another high touch area with all of the books. And the media centers will be housing other instructional spaces. So again, that's working with each building principal and really utilizing space incredibly well, which is what the state has asked us to do. The social distancing in the cafeteria, this came up several times, and it was a great question. And we've modified the document to be reflective of the cafeteria. Needs to be 6 feet social distancing. The first planning document actually had it at 3 feet, but since children, if they are in the cafeteria, do have their mask off, it should be 6 feet. So we've modified that in the document just for clarity. Looking at schedules, how will students move through their electives? It's going to be different again at each age. And when you think about electives, for instance, in middle school, the electives are going to be part of their cohort teams. So electives will change every 6 or 9 weeks, and they're working on their schedules right now, but it will look different. And I think again, setting those expectations that it's not going to look like it always has, but we're going to make sure that the electives are still, high quality electives for our students. There are areas that are considered high risk right now. Chorus is a high risk activity, and band, where you're blowing all of the band instruments. And so there's a lot of science behind that. Those may have to stay virtual, definitely for the first month or so of school, and it could be longer than that. And that again is going to depend on health and safety and what they're telling us. But it's hard to play, a clarinet with the mask on, even if it has a slit in it, and putting it in a bag or something of that nature. When you're talking about, for instance, middle school students, 13 and 14-year-olds, that's a lot to manage to even try. And so we are, again, taking the guidance from the health-related fields about what are the high risk activities. So it will look different. So will fall sports happen? This comes up probably on most of the focus groups. The CIAC is the group that governs the sports and activities for high school. And right now they are planning a full return to sports. And that's where they're sitting. But will it actually happen when school starts? We don't know. Some of their sports start on or around August 17th. And so we'll have a little bit of a leadway before school starts. And we'll see if they actually are able to get through practices and without shutting down. Because this summer, even with some of the conditioning groups, there have been some conditioning groups that didn't make it through the first week for some school districts before there was somebody who tested positive. So it's probably going to be very fluid. I will say with CIAC, when they made a decision last spring to cancel the spring sports, it was a really difficult decision, but they did it based on the safety and getting the guidance from those people, who advise us from the health and safety fields. So what about chorus and band? I've already mentioned that a little bit. Those are high risk activities, highly likely going to be, both of those highly likely going to stay virtual when we start school, according to the guidance that we have right now. Assessments, how will we know where gaps in learning could be for a student? And this is one where, again, we've spoken a little bit about it. We did a showcase for the Board of Education at one of our earlier meetings, which is Link It. It's a brand new platform for us, and we will be able to give, as a fourth grader, for instance, at the end of third grade, we'll be able to give that fourth grader the end of third grade assessment. It aligns to our Connecticut standards, so we'll know exactly where those gaps or holes may be if there was something that was more difficult for a student to learn through distance versus face-to-face. So we do have a new platform ready to go. The other question is, it goes along with even the schedule that Mark had, having as much normalcy as possible for our students. Will we have assessments and be able to give some feedback about the learning? Absolutely. We want that to look more normal than it did last spring as far as basic assessments. So for lunches, if you are a remote learning student, you would pick up your lunch in the parking lot at the school site of your choice. And that's no different than we've done all spring, and we're continuing to do this summer. It will just be figuring out how many students are needing to pick up lunch so that someone is walking out 20 lunches or 15 or 100, depending on how many students are going to pick up at particular sites. But we will still have lunch for those students who are on remote learning at school. Full distance learning would operate as it does today. Again, same stops, exactly what we've done since we initiated our food service in the remote learning program. For the month of June, Dr. Carabillo was just sharing this with me this morning, and I put it on here at the last minute when she gave it to me because I think it's very celebratory in that we served 25,721 meals. And I don't think that sometimes we underestimate what we've asked even for our food service department and what they've been doing all spring, all summer, at the height of COVID, when it was still very challenging to be out and about, even with the mask and gloves. Sometimes it was a little scary. They've just done Herculean work, and 25,000 meals is a lot. And it also goes to show the need in our community and the demographics. Not all families are going to find it easy to buy a mask. Not all families are going to find it easy to have additional art supplies and other things. So I think it just bodes well for all of us as a reminder about we have food insecurity in our community. And I want to mention also, we do partner with Neighbor to Neighbor, who actually does boxes of food for families on the weekend, and also filling in the blanks. And we've been partnering with them to even do the drop-offs this summer. So we're very grateful. And I also have one more. United Way has been such a partner through this whole thing, and they really have helped us organize, been hugely helpful for me to connect with these other organizations so that we're all working together across town. And they just gave a grant to our PTA for some meals for this summer, where they're going to handle some of the Fridays. And we're very, very grateful, again, to United Way and our PTA for helping us even this summer. Thanks, Mike. I'm sorry, Mary.
to go back to the other slide, instead of saying lunch, do you want to say meals? Because it's lunch and breakfast for kids. So I think we should signal that they are getting both meals from us. And then you could also put in a bullet about the food insecurity programs that we have that will continue for food on the weekends, because it is a lot more substantive than just lunch.
Yeah, and we haven't made the determination yet on how we're going to handle breakfast for these students. Part of it's going to depend on how many students are, we will do breakfast, but if you remember when we first started in March, we actually did them at the same time, and then we switched to hot breakfast and lunch. But if these families that choose to stay home, it may be at the lunch pickup. We may not do a breakfast and a lunch, because breakfast right now, I'm a little concerned just about traffic going into the fall. So we may not want extra families coming, but I can word that much better than it is. So thank you for that.
Oh, and Tony, just to, if we're going to resurvey parents, at least the ones that are going to be choosing the remote options, it might be very helpful to say, if you are, to ask them if they are planning to utilize this option and if they have the ability to pick up the lunches. If not, that way we can better coordinate families that aren't able to do pickup if we need to do some delivery service.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We can add that to the survey. And just for those people who are watching, we are absolutely committed to making sure that families that may be in unique situations still get food. And we actually do deliver every day to some of our families because they, for instance, they may have 4 little ones, and the teenagers watching the 4 little ones because mom or dad are at work, and the teenager, it's a little dangerous to go out and try to manage 4 little siblings and try to get their lunches. So we've stepped in some areas like that. And we also have perhaps somebody with a disability that is, or immune compromised and is really not getting out of the house at all right now. So we are committed to that, and putting it on the survey is a great idea just to help us pre-plan. So thank you. So budget, isn't this expensive to purchase additional items? Yes, 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 yes. It is. And we are doing the very best that we can to make sure that we are very thoughtful about what we're purchasing, making sure that we're getting the items that we need for everybody to feel safe. And then the question is, how will we pay for equipment, staffing, and supplies? So the federal government has a grant called the CARES Act. And for Greenwich, we expect our number is 850,000. But of that 850,000, a portion of that must go to private schools. And there's still a debate about the formula and how that money will be distributed. Just over a week ago, we got a letter. We thought it was resolved, and you could choose number 1 or number 2 of which way you wanted to distribute. And one of them was based on Title I. The other one was based strictly on student enrollment. So it would be all the Greenwich Public School students, all the private school students, and it's you divide the money by student. We were looking at going with the Title I option, but the state, obviously there's some discussion that needed to still happen, because 2 days later they pulled back on that and said, wait, we're not going to open the system up yet. So we know the number is 850. We don't know how much of that we will be able to spend. We think it's going to be somewhere between 600, 650. But once we get above 600, 650, it's going to be asking for an interim, and the town has told us, and they expect that we're going to be coming for an interim. We've worked closely, as Sean does, obviously, with the finance side on the town with Roland, and making sure we know how we're coding things. And just as an example, go ahead and go to the next slide, if you would. So this just gives you a running total, and this was earlier in the week. It's actually gone up because we've bought more things since then. But everything from, the sanitizer, disinfectant, gloves, wipes, the respirators, face masks, certain sprayers. We have on here the student meal delivery. There's some, expense to that. That's additional. We have to have face masks on the bus, face masks, for nurses, face masks at the schools for our custodial staff. We floor tape, boxes, gowns, full gowns. We have people who not only are nurses, but people change diapers, are in a very high touch area, especially for preschool. So the level of equipment you need in preschool is even more so than you would see, for instance, if I'm a high school math teacher. And this is just, again, sneeze guards, this is just an example, and I would say this number now is it's definitely over 600. I'm going to try to have this updated for tonight's meeting, just so the board can see where we are. We have posted for 13 temporary positions, which are not reflected on here, for maintenance, because we know we have to have more people to help us disinfect around the building on a daily basis. We will probably have a few FTE that are going to be needed for the elementary schedule. We're trying to really fine tune that right now on the FTE. We also have more technology equipment that doesn't show up on here. We are making sure we have the webcams, the microphones, much needed equipment there. And we also have our laptops, which are reflected on here for COVID for elementary, which was a huge need for our teachers, because they didn't have any laptops. They had an iPad and they found it incredibly difficult utilizing them for distance learning. So we're filling in the gaps and holes so that we're ready for this, but this list is going to continue to grow, and it does almost on a daily basis. Any questions about the budget or anything that was any of the Q&A? Sorry, I can't see all of you. Let me see if I can get the tile version.
I'll just say thank you so much for going into such great detail with us today. I know these are the things that I've been hearing questions about, so I know that more details and things will be coming forward as we move along between now and August. But thank you so much for sharing this today, because I know that there were a lot of questions, and I think that this has hopefully answered a lot of the bigger ones that people are starting to ask before we can get into further detail.
Great, thank you. And if you think of anything else, please email me, because we update constantly. It's a daily process. We'll make changes to the slides, I'm sure, before you see them tonight, based on your questions and the input that we get. Any other questions? Just to remind the community, if you go to greenwichschools.org, on the main page, right in the middle, scroll down a little bit depending on the size of your screen, there is the planning page. You click on that. All of these meetings are recorded. Any of the documents that we've used are on there. And all of that information is available for the public. There's a ton of information. The old distance learning tag is also still there. So if there's something that you wanted to go back and review from before, all the information that we send out to families is also there, the family notes. So I encourage people, if you're really wanting to spend some time, go in and look at a lot of those documents, and it's very helpful. All righty, any more questions? We wore you out with all the talking. All right, thank you. Have a great afternoon.